Hello, and welcome to my midweek meditation. Before I get started, I want you to know that there will be no meditation next week. I'm taking a bit of a vacation, but Lord willing, I will be back 2 weeks from today, and I hope you join me again then. We are going through the book of Revelation in these meditations, and before we jump into our passage today, I want to give you another brief review. The book of Revelation is made up of 7 sections. Each section gives us a viewpoint of the whole of the last days, which are all of the days between the 2 advents of Jesus. I'm representing that structure with this diagram. So far in our study, we have read 7 letters to 7 churches. We have seen the opening of 7 seals. We have heard the sounding of 7 trumpets. In the last several weeks, we have been looking at 7 symbolic histories. Today, we are going to look at the 7th history, which means we are going to finish looking at the 4th viewpoint. Now, before we start looking at the passage, I have a question for those of you who have been watching all of the midweek meditations. What should we expect as we look at the 7th symbolic history? What do you think is going to occur in this history? To help you answer that question, I'll ask you just a few more. Do you remember what we saw when the 6th and 7th seals were opened? We saw the end of the world, the second advent of Jesus. Do you remember what event occurred when the 7th trumpet sounded? Again, it was the return of Christ. The 7th trumpet sounded before the final judgment, which will happen at the return of Christ. So what should we expect as we look at the 7th symbolic history? The answer is the second advent of Jesus, and that is what we indeed see. Listen to how the passage begins. Verse 14 says, "Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud, one like a son of man." That is clearly a reference to Jesus. And you might remember that at the ascension of Jesus, the angels declared that he will return on a cloud. We're told the same truth at the beginning of the book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 1 says, "Behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. And all tribes of the earth will wail on account of him. Even so, amen." So it's quite clear, he will return on a cloud. And we see in Revelation 14 that his cloud is white because he is holy and pure. Now, look at the end of verse 14. It tells us he will come with a sharp sickle in his hand, meaning he is going to come for a harvest of people. Listen to the whole passage. "Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, 'Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is fully ripe.' So he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over the fire, and he called with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, 'Put in your sickle, and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe.' So the angel swung his sickle across the earth and gathered the grape harvest of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia." This passage is about one event, but it contains 2 harvests, and the harvests are described with a lot of parallelism. I want to show you that parallelism with this chart. Verses 14 through 16 are harvest A, and verses 17 through 20 are harvest B. In both harvests, there is a sickle. There is someone wielding the sickle. We see an angel coming out of the temple who calls out in a loud voice. We hear the command, "Put in your sickle," and we hear a reference to the harvest being ripe. That is a lot of similarity, and it serves to highlight two major differences. One difference is this. In harvest A, it is Jesus who is wielding the sickle. In harvest B, it is an angel. And the second difference is that the two harvests end very differently. In harvest A, after the harvest is reaped, we are told nothing else, because nothing else needs to be said. We all know what happens after a harvest. The harvest is kept and enjoyed. One naturally thinks of a grain harvest when you read about harvest A. Harvest B is different. Grapes are harvested, and we are told they're put into a wine press. But the wine press is specifically called a wine press of wrath. And what comes from the wine press is referred to as blood. And there is lots of blood. Look at the passage again. We are told this: the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia. That's a lot of blood. It's terrible to think about blood being as high as a horse's bridle for 180 miles, which is approximately what 1,600 stadia equals. No one is sure what 1,600 is symbolic for. One possibility is this. In the Old Testament, the number 40 is associated with some significant moments of punishment. For instance, during the days of Noah, when the flood came, the rain fell 40 days and 40 nights. And after the Israelites were stubborn in the wilderness, God made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years. 40 squared, 40 times 40, is 1,600. So it's possible that this number is symbolic for complete punishment, full punishment. Concerning symbolism, what I find even more interesting in this passage is this. The word sickle appears exactly 7 times in this passage. Since the number 7 plays such an ongoing role in the book of Revelation, I don't think that is coincidence. We're being shown that at the return of Jesus, the harvest of people will be complete. And we are being shown that the harvest will have 2 different outcomes. There will be the gathering of God's people who will be saved for all eternity. That will be a glorious harvest, and Jesus will personally, lovingly gather in his people. But there will also be the harvest of unbelievers who will be gathered together to experience God's wrath. Now, I want to ask and answer one final question today. Why is the pouring out of blood of unbelievers so graphically described? I submit to you that the answer is in a related prophecy found in the book of Joel. In Joel chapter 3, Joel is describing the judgment of all the nations. And in verse 13, he says something. He gives a prophecy that's very similar to the prophecy we've been reading in the book of Revelation. Verse 13 says, "Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Go in, tread, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their evil is great. Joel describes a harvest of people, just like the book of Revelation, and also just like Revelation, they are put into a wine press. And here we are told it's because their deeds were evil. Their evil was great. And listen to what we're told about their evil a few verses later. Starting in verse 19. Egypt shall become a desolation, and Edom a desolate wilderness, for the violence done to the people of Judah, because they have shed innocent blood in their land. But Judah shall be inhabited forever, and Jerusalem to all generations. I will avenge their blood, blood I have not avenged, for the Lord dwells in Zion. Their evil is the shedding of innocent blood, and Joel prophesies that that innocent blood will be avenged by God. The book of Revelation is showing us that the vengeance will be full and complete. It shows us that because this book was especially written for Christians who are being persecuted, Christians who are shedding their blood. I hope that we never face terrible persecution, the shedding of blood. But if we do, it will be important to know the book of Revelation. It was written for our encouragement. It was written to help us endure. This book keeps showing us that Christ will return. He is the victor. He is going to make all things right. He will save his people for all eternity. This book spurs us on. It helps us stand firm. As you celebrate Christmas this week, as you celebrate the first advent of Jesus, as you reflect on the baby Jesus laying humbly in a manger, realize that his second advent is going to be very different. He's going to return showing his full glory, his full power and might. He is going to return to gather his people in and give them joy for all eternity. He is going to return to pour out his vengeance on his enemies, to pour out his wrath on those who persecuted him and persecuted his people. As you worship Jesus this week, realize you are worshiping the true King of Kings. You are worshiping him who will give you eternal joy. Worship him humbly. Worship him gladly. You know, the first advent of Jesus was nearly 2,000 years ago. The second advent may be very near. So worship Jesus with excitement and have a blessed Christmas. Thank you for joining me.